today for the Race, Wealth, and Homeownership Conference. I want to welcome you to our session today titled Public Private Partnerships. I'm Greg Johnson. I'm the CEO of the Cincinnati Metropolitan Housing Authority, and I'm excited to talk about public-private partnerships in our community and outside our community with our esteemed guests. So let's get right into it. First, I would like to present Mr. Brian Swanton. He's transitioned into his role of President and Chief Executive Officer of the Gorman and Company in 2018, after serving as the Arizona Market President since 2008. During his tenure as Market President, Mr. Swanson led multidisciplinary team that designed and constructed over 1,000 units of new housing across the state of Arizona. So let's welcome Mr. Brian Swanton as he goes through his presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Director Johnson. Hi, everybody. Great to be with you. I'm sitting here in Madison, Wisconsin, and spend a lot of my time in Phoenix, Arizona, but working very closely with CMHA in Cincinnati on some large-scale public housing redevelopment in a public-private partnership with Director Johnson. So it's really exciting to be with you today and talk a little bit about what public-private partnerships mean to us and what they look like to us from the for-profit perspective. And you get some other both for-profit and nonprofits perspectives later on. And just a little bit about Gorman and Company on the next slide. Gorman and Company is one of the top 15 affordable housing developers in the U.S. We are based here in Madison, Wisconsin. We have offices in multiple states across the country, about almost 7,000 units now, and about 84 projects across 7 states, and always building more. We have about 3,000 units in the pipeline right now, and 11 projects under construction in multiple states across the U.S. as well. So next slide. Gorman and Company oftentimes are nonprofit partners and our housing authority partners, profit or a nonprofit. And I tell her, well, it depends on the year and the day, I guess. So some years we feel like a nonprofit. But actually that question is a really good one. And I was almost honored that she asked me, the executive of a for-profit enterprise, if we're a for-profit or a nonprofit, because we have a lot of DNA at Gorman and Company. We're a mission-driven for-profit. So we share a lot of synergies of purpose and synergies of mission with nonprofits and public housing authorities. And that's really important in structuring public-private partnerships to really have a sensitivity and understanding for those that you're entering into a partnership with. But our core purpose is to initiate strategies and implement solutions to revitalize communities and build strong neighborhoods. So we're a real estate developer, yes, but really our core purpose is revitalizing communities, revitalizing neighborhoods. Next slide. I'm a big fan of Jim Collins' book, Good to Great. And he talks a lot about, in that book, the hedgehog concept. And I would encourage all organizations, for-profit, nonprofit, public sector, to really think about the 3 circles of the hedgehog concept, particularly in light of structuring partnerships with other enterprises. And those 3 circles involve what are you deeply passionate about, sort of what drives the heart of your organization. What can you be the best in the world at? What is that one thing that you are really good at and could be the best in the world at? And number 3, of course, what drives your economic engine? And all of us, regardless of what sector we're in, have to be concerned about our economic engine. And a lot of people think about nonprofits as if they shouldn't make a profit. But I always tell folks, I used to work in the nonprofit world, and I used to say, no money, no mission. And so it takes money to fuel all of our organizations, and that's an important element. So our hedgehog concept, when you sort of combine all 3, that overlap in the center for us really comes down to developing real estate projects with significant barriers to entry that create value for communities, and really both value and equity for communities. Next slide. I also do a lot of teaching at the university level. If we can move to the next slide, please. I think we might be stuck on the current slide here, but I'll just keep going. Here we go. I do a lot of teaching with young undergraduate, graduate level students who are studying real estate or business or what have you. And we often talk about affordable housing, whether it be rental housing or for sale housing. And always start with trying to define what is affordable housing. What does that even mean? And understanding that is really important. Because all housing is affordable to somebody, right? And and this image really describes it well. Well, it's only $500 a month, but it's a cardboard box, right? And so affordability is a value proposition. It's also a quality and equity proposition as well. So we have to think about all three prongs there. The quality of the housing is definitely important. But also the quality of things like the location of the housing and access to services. And just think about yourselves when you're choosing housing for yourself, whether you live in a house, an apartment, what have you, what services are important to you? What if you were in a wheelchair? What if you had a mental illness? What if you are a chronically homeless veteran? Add that onto the mix, and what services then are important to you. So it's really a quality question, but quality about the housing and the location and access to services as well. Next slide. At Gorman and Company, we really try and structure our relationships with our partners. If we can move to the next slide, please. Thinking about health. And we try and look at real estate development through the lens of public health and the social determinants of health. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this concept. But a healthy community isn't just about providing affordable housing. That's what we do for a living. That's what drives our economic engine. But in building and designing housing, I have to think about things like economic stability of the people I'm housing, the social and community context of the housing I'm building, what the neighborhood and the environment is like around the housing that I'm building. What does access look like to things like healthcare and healthy foods? And what is the education infrastructure in that community? So affordable housing really can't be looked at in a vacuum. It has to be looked at through this social determinants of health and through this health lens. And oftentimes, what we'll do, especially on large scale redevelopment work, we'll often start with implementing what's called a health impact assessment, or an HIA. A lot of people have heard of environmental impact assessments, but we do health impact assessments and evaluate these social determinants of health, because it's really about understanding that a person's zip code is really a stronger predictor to their potential health outcomes than their genetic code. And so location matters. So it's not just about the bricks and sticks of what you're building. It's about all of those elements in the community around those bricks and sticks that make a healthy community. Next slide. And housing authorities, Director Johnson is keenly aware of sort of inheriting sort of some of the mistakes of the past and trying to manage what was sort of back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, a very top-down, federally regulated, federally directed mass production program to warehouse the poor. And they weren't all designed like Pruitt-Igoe and Cabrini Green in Chicago, like what you see here. Some of them are very low density versions of what you see here. But think about the social determinants of health when you're looking at some of the old public housing stock in this country. And I hear from housing authority directors all over the country that, I'm dealing with the capital improvement needs of a building like this that's built in a horrible context. And I have maybe $800 per unit per year to, address capital needs. And so if the physical infrastructure of what you're dealing with is failing, then all of the other social determinants will fail along with it. So we really can't rely solely, especially on a top-down federal government driven approach. Next slide. And we could just kind of skip on this one, but we need to tear down those old paradigms. And on the next slide, create public-private partnerships, because those are really truly proven to produce the best results, because public-private partnerships bring the best of the public sector, attempt to bring the best of the nonprofit sector and the best of the for-profit sector together in partnership to create a new paradigm for affordable housing in this country. Next slide. I'll just show you a few examples. This is a development, an old public housing development that we had knocked down on 12 acres of land in Mesa, Arizona. I personally developed this project during the midst of the recession in 2010. And next slide. We've also developed mixed-use developments in partnership with nonprofits. In this case, this is a project that I developed with a church. And the church owned a 2-acre parcel of land, so they were land rich and really cash poor. They had a thrift store on the site and wanted to redevelop the thrift store, but it was on light rail and very convenient access to transportation and grocery stores and recreation. And so we worked in partnership with them. They put their land into the transaction. We built them a brand new thrift store. They leased us the land. We leased them back the thrift store. And then we built 50 units of affordable housing above. And we have 50% of our residents here actually are in wheelchairs, and we have less than a 30% car ownership rate in this development. So it's really projects like these that illustrate the power of public-private partnerships. Next slide. Just 2 or 3 more examples, and we can scroll through these rather quickly. This is a project that we just finished construction on in Keystone, Colorado. The interesting element on this project, and this is rental housing. We're primarily a rental housing developer. But this land, massively expensive land and some of the most beautiful confines I've ever developed in. But we don't own the land. We own the improvements. Vail Resorts, the operator of the Keystone Ski Resort, owns the land, and they're in desperate need of worker housing. They had land ownership, but did not have the technical wherewithal to bring the other partners to the table to build a combination of affordable and workforce housing. And so we developed some seasonal housing here for ski lift operators and other folks that work in the ski resort industry part-time. And then we developed a phase of low-income housing, tax credit housing, it's very affordable. And then an element of year-round workforce housing for the missing middle, if you will. Folks that live in this community, work in this community, but can't afford luxury market rate prices in a place like Keystone. Next slide. And we've even taken those public-private partnerships to places like Madison, Wisconsin, where I'm sitting today. We're under construction on a final phase of a multi-phase development on land that was owned by the city of Madison. And here we have multiple phases, including a health clinic through the UW Health program that we developed and constructed in the first phase. We've developed 3 phases of affordable housing. And here we have a mixed use luxury market rate product as the final phase that we're building out today. So it's really about building housing for a different mix of economic bases. Next slide. And some of the other super high barrier to entry locations that we've worked in is the Florida Keys. We have 3 projects in the Florida Keys where our neighbors are literally billionaires and the workers cannot find housing anywhere. It's just a very, very limited supply, but the service worker demand is very, very high. And that's an economic imbalance. And so we work with the county, Monroe County in this case, on 3 separate developments. We enter into long-term ground lease structures and partner with the state agency to secure tax credit financing. Next slide, you can kind of see an elevation of the development. This project was built about 6-7 years ago. And it's just become a shining example of how public-private partnerships can develop housing in some of the most highest barrier to entry locations in the U.S. Next slide. And Director Johnson, I can go on forever too. So when it's my time, just tell me to stop talking. I lost track of time, so feel free to just jump right in. But I'll talk about a few rules of thumb in getting started. Number one, every project is very unique and different. There is no one size fits all. Every site is different. The partnerships are different. Even if you're trying to design a prototype project and repeat that project in multiple places, you're going to run into different environmental considerations, different social determinants of health, because those issues are very location driven. And every project obviously is developed at a different spot. Smaller projects don't always equal easier projects. That's a misnomer. Oftentimes folks say, well, let's start small. Well, doing a small project sometimes can be even more difficult than a large scale project. It's harder to find equity investors and lenders to work with you on small projects. It's more difficult to manage. You don't have economies of scale to afford full-time on-site staff and supportive services. So the fewer the sources of financing, the better. Public-private partnerships are complicated in and of themselves, In the affordable housing space, we tend to want to overcomplicate things. I developed a project in Phoenix recently that had 13 different sources of financing. And we were all celebrating how complicated it was. And we just stopped and thought, what are we doing? It shouldn't be this difficult. We shouldn't need 13 sources of financing to get this project done. In that case, we did, and it got done. But needless to say, the fewer the sources, definitely the better. And then create a strong development team. You know, it's important to look beyond just the developer and who the development partners are in a transaction. Who's your consultant? Who's your attorney? Who are your accountants, your architects, your brokers, your general contractors? A lot of due diligence needs to go into the full team in any partnership, because you're going to be working side by side for a very long period of time. And when things don't go well, you're going to have many more problems if you really don't know your partners well. And partnerships are great in theory, but I think oftentimes I see folks getting into partnership without really designing that partnership from the get-go, from day one, sort of outlining expectations, risks, rewards. We just went through that exercise last year with CMHA, Director Johnson's organization, where we actually created almost like an opportunity grid, or sort of a stream of benefits grid, where the housing authority would outline in a literal grid what's important to them. And we as a developer would outline on that same sheet of paper what's important to us. And then you find ways to meet in the middle when there's conflict between those two efforts. But you have to take a very deliberate approach to structuring a partnership. You don't want to just fall into it and assume it's going to work out well. It has to be designed very deliberately. And then, of course, I always tell my students, your developer fee is your contingency. Don't spend it before you get it, because you may not get it. And, you know, this is sausage making. These projects are complex, and they don't always go perfectly well. So Director Johnson is telling me I'm 1 minute over time. And so I think this is the point where I will pass the baton back to Director Johnson for our next speaker, and happy to answer any questions at the end. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that presentation. A lot of information, as you said, these complicated deals, but we want to make sure that we give all of our guests opportunity, and then we'll have time for questions and follow up at the end. So my next presenter today in public-private partnership will be Joe Hall. He is the Vice President of Development for Wallet Communities. In his current role, he focuses on the production of new affordable housing through new construction efforts and the preservation of existing affordable housing through substantial renovations. Overall, Joe has been in affordable housing industry for 12 years, focusing in the areas of project organization, finance, acquisition, and asset management. Joe is also a certified public accountant and currently resides in Columbus, Ohio. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I greatly appreciate it. Great to be a part of this panel. Brian, thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, just all great information. Thank you for sharing that. Again, as Mr. John said, my name is Joe Hall. I am a Vice President of Real Estate Development for Wallet Communities. Next slide, please. I just want to start off to give an overview of who Wallet Communities is. We are an organization that was formed in the mid-1960s. Our substantial platform, though, is affordable housing. We do the gamut of all real estate services, whether we develop, we construct, we property manage, or we do long-term ownership through asset management. We are an organization that has almost 180 properties in our portfolio, for which 70% of those we own and manage, 30% we manage for others. That equates to about 13,000 residential units. About half are families and half are for seniors. So really exciting to be a part of Wallach and its affordable housing efforts. Next slide, please. Wallach, we try to organize ourselves and hold ourselves to three pillars, which would be care, character, and collaboration. Today, really more importantly, would be the collaboration piece of those three pillars as far as working in public-private partnerships. Next slide, please. So that I just show the next slide here to reflect that Wallach has a substantial presence in Southwest Ohio. Really glad to be here, and it's nice to present in the area that we do substantial amount of business in. So next slide, please. Wallach also is in the business of trying to provide the best resident experience that we can for our tenants. And one way to do that is through connecting our tenants with services that are available out in the community that they may not otherwise be able to connect with. So by doing that and focusing on our pillar of care, probably 10 years ago or so now, Wallach created a service coordination organization called Resident Resources Network that is now a standalone organization that's self-sufficient. But it's a resident service coordination organization that provides service coordinators at properties where we can, that allows the professional on site to then connect the residents to services, whether it be within the community or outside the community, to enhance their experience at our properties and enhance their quality of life. So another great piece that Wallach does and affiliates with, and just another piece that highlights one more component of public-private partnership. Next slide, please. I think quite often when we think of public-private partnership, we take it very simplistically that says, okay, it's public and it's private, and you put the two together, and there you have it. But this slide, I'm trying to articulate that there's just many different stakeholders that are involved in a public-private partnership or a project. I'll just briefly go through each of these and highlight the important significance of each of the players. For example, state agencies provide a substantial amount of funding to our projects, whether they be from federal or state sources. Local housing authorities do a great job of bringing our communities to the local folks and being able to partner with them, whether it be a site that they have available that needs developed, or able to bring maybe rental subsidy to the table that help prop up our projects. Developers, as Brian said, you have developers in many forms, whether it be for-profit or nonprofit. They're the folks that try to steer the ship to get the project to the finish line. Cities, counties, and townships, very important. You want to be where you're wanted. So you definitely need to know the locality that you're trying to do business in. Even on a more micro level, you need to get to know your neighborhoods and the residents that live there, and try to educate those folks on what you're trying to do in their community, because you really do need buy-in from the local folks to be able to do work in their communities. Local vendors and subcontractors, just the more local you can be, the better off you are, because the more local you are, the more folks know about what you're trying to do in that community and know what's best for that community. And that certainly bodes true for our local vendors and subcontractors. It also allows for us to invest back into the community by using local vendors, whether it's a Section 3 contractor or maybe a Section 3 individual. Maybe it's a WBE or an MBE entity that we're able to do work with, being a women's owned business or a minority owned business. It allows for us to recontribute to the community from investment dollars to folks that live right there in the community. Private foundations are outstanding to help bring additional resources to the project that you may not be able to find otherwise. When you're talking about substantial renovations, we really want to partner with our stakeholders, being the property managers and the service coordinators on site. They know the properties the best. They know the needs of the properties the best, and they know the needs of the residents the best. So it's great to have them looped in to help bring a project to completion. Architects and general contractors, we all need folks that design the projects and are also able to complete the projects for us and get everything done in a timely manner and on budget. And then last but not least, from this list is the lenders. They obviously bring a very important key component to our capital stack, being that of loans. So lenders are an important piece of the stakeholders as well for public-private partnership. Next slide, please. Just to delve a little deeper into the sources that bring public-private partnerships together and those financing tools. HUD is a big player that can bring many outstanding sources to our public-private partnerships. One being the Rental Assistance Demonstration, also known as RAD. That is a HUD program that allows for us to do substantial renovations to whether it be public housing or maybe privately owned housing that could be owned by a nonprofit and be senior housing, things like that. Special types of housing products that we're able to run through that program to do substantial renovations that we might not be able to do otherwise. FHA financing HUD brings to the table. They bring great loan products to the table with very good lending terms to allow for us to have sources to do these projects. The federal low-income housing tax credit, or what you might hear as LIHTC, whether it's the 9% program or the 4% program, that's definitely a public-private partnership where we use federal tax credits to be able to bring in private dollars from financial institutions to bring in funds to the projects. State and local gap funding. It seems like once we get down to the end of these projects, we're still searching for those last few dollars to make our projects work. And that's where state and local gap funding become very paramount, whether it be home funds, CDBG funds, or AHP funds. They're the ones that are able to finally complete the puzzle as far as sources and uses to make projects viable. And again, I referenced it earlier, anytime you can get a local rental subsidy support to your project, just helps it really prop it up from a financial perspective and allow folks to live in the projects that might not be able to otherwise. Next slide, please. Just to highlight a couple projects that articulate public-private partnerships that we've done recently. The Evanston, this is a project that is owned and has been developed by Cincinnati Metropolitan Housing Authority. It did go through a RAD conversion, as I referenced before, with FHA financing to bring a substantial renovation to this property that allowed it to be viable for at least another 20 years at least. And Wally Communities was fortunate enough to be able to partner in this endeavor as a general contractor to the project. Next slide, please. Another example is very similar in nature. Again, we have another high-rise that is owned by Cincinnati Metropolitan Housing Authority that's currently going through the process of being completed as we speak. Again, Cincinnati Metropolitan Housing Authority is the developer and owner of this project called Park Eden. And again, Wallach is the general contractor. Also going through the RAD conversion program and also having FHA financing, but another piece of the puzzle that's been added in the form of 4% LIHTC or low-income housing tax credits. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, there's a variety of ways to participate in public-private partnerships and be a variety of different stakeholders. For example, Wallach is a property manager for Columbus Metropolitan Housing Authority for 7 properties for over a 5-year period. And Wallach Communities as property managers helping Columbus Metropolitan Housing Authority navigate the RAD process, which is public-private partnerships, and to try to get those projects through that process by 2023. Where the property manager comes into play there is a great stakeholder for the developer and the general contractor to understand the property and the property's need on the boots on the ground from what does the property need physically and what do the residents need, and how do you plan with the residents to be able to complete a substantial renovation to be as least burdening to the residents as we can. So we really appreciate our partnership with Columbus Metropolitan Housing Authority in the form of a property manager. Next slide, please. This is a project actually we did a few years back in the Pendleton neighborhood. This has got just a whole laundry list of different folks that were able to allow for this project to be renovated. We call it Cutter Apartments. We actually partnered with Over the Rhine Community Housing on this project. We used a local WBE architect called City Studios. This was financed by a lender, River Hills Bank. This project is 40 units of Section 8 housing. We were able to get gap funding from both the state agency and the city of Cincinnati, as well as able to use low-income housing tax credits and historic tax credits to make this project viable. So if you take any one of those stakeholders out of the mix, this project wouldn't have been viable. So each and every one's as crucial as the next. Next project, please. I include this slide just to articulate that public-private partnerships not just happening in your backyard, it's happening all across the country. And I think as Brian mentioned, this is really the best way to be able to execute good, strong projects as long as the complexities of the partnership don't get away from us. This one here is one that we are working to get to a closing to be able to start the renovation and the new construction. Here you'll see the 2 blocks at the bottom of the site design is our 2 vacant school buildings. And then to the right, we're going to go ahead and also do 4-story new construction, all for seniors age 55 plus. This has got a whole bunch of different components to it to make it viable as a public-private partnership. We do have 9% low-income housing tax credits. We have a direct lending product and gap funding from the state agency. The city of Detroit is putting home funds towards this project, as well as providing favorable real estate tax treatment. We have vouchers from the Detroit Housing Commission. And we've actually partnered with a local nonprofit called Presbyterian Villages of Michigan, who is the preeminent provider of senior services in the Detroit area. So with all those great components, we're able to do these great projects like this. Next slide, please. And then last but not least, we have another form of a public-private partnership for which this campus is owned by a nonprofit called the Senior Alliance. They have been willing to donate land to our project to be able to build 100 units of new senior housing for age 55 plus and older. Here, this has tax credits. It has direct lending and gap funding from both the county and the state agency. And we also have vouchers from the Veterans Administration, as well as favorable tax treatment from the city perspective. So again, a lot of different stakeholders come together to make this project viable. And again, I can't emphasize enough, if one of these stakeholders wasn't in place, then the project simply wouldn't be viable. So that basically articulates, next slide, please. That articulates my thought process for today on the public-private partnership side of things, just really emphasizing these are great projects when the right parties come together and have a like vision. So Mr. Johnson, thank you for the time today.
Thank you so much for the information. I really appreciate it. As you were speaking, we got a lot of questions, so we'll see if we can get to those questions at the end. Our next speaker is local and well known, Mr. of Housing, Homesteading, and Urban Redevelopment Corporation, HERC for short, a 501c3 Ohio nonprofit corporation focused on community housing improvement, and in particular, the renovation of homes in low to moderate income areas. Deborah.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Thank you for inviting me to speak with both Brian and Joe about public-private partnerships in relationship to the port's role in affordable housing. I would like to talk about our partnerships with our managed entities, municipalities, and community partners. But I would first like to start giving you a brief introduction with regards to the port. Next slide, please. And our managed entities. The port's goal is to make real estate work for everyone in Hamilton County, and we do this by focusing on 3 pillars. Our industrial revitalization pillar, which has a goal of bringing 500 acres of land to the county to create opportunities for advanced manufacturing, thus bringing great paying jobs to the region. Our public finance division that uses innovative tools to assist in crafting and financing complex development projects. And then our neighborhood revitalization work that works in areas that have long-term disinvestment and requires a holistic real estate strategy in order to catalyze equitable growth. The port does this by utilizing its managed entities, which include the Hamilton County Land Bank, the Homesteading and Urban Redevelopment Corporation, which is the entity that I manage and is also a nonprofit entity, as well as the Foreign Trade Zone. Next slide, please. The port's role in affordable housing is actually an ecosystem that has many parts, to include partnerships where we work with entities on acquisition, stabilization of structures, and demolition for them to be able to do their work. Then we do have our own direct construction, which brings broader affordability. And then lastly, our affordable financing tools via our public finance arm. Next slide, please. Our longest standing continued impact is through the HERC, which is a countywide CDC which has been in existence since 1976. And since that time, HERC has brought over 700 homes to market. The port began managing HERC back in 2015, and since that time, we've completed 33 house rehabs and sold them to income-qualified buyers. One of the differentiators for the HERC is that we have a focus on providing worry-free housing by usually completely gutting severely blighted properties down to the studs and bringing them completely back to productive use with today's buyer in mind. The houses all have new mechanicals, new roofs, windows, appliances, kitchens, bathrooms, which in essence creates stability and a worry-free home ownership experience for buyers. However, as reiterated by both Brian and Joe, this comes at a cost. The average subsidy per house is approximately $40,000, meaning that we sell the houses at a greater discount below the actual construction cost. And even though there is a great amount of subsidy in it, it would be even greater if we were not able to partner with the Hamilton County Land Bank in order to acquire these properties from them at a relatively low cost. Next slide. We also apply for grants to assist in covering the gap and utilize the Port's revolving loan fund via the Greater Cincinnati Foundation to finance construction. We also have other partners that help help pay for the subsidy, which includes Hamilton County Home Funds, which we're utilizing in the village of Lincoln Heights, as well as Woodlawn, City NOFA funds that we used in Evanston. LISC, the Finance Fund, Farmer Family Foundation, which we utilize those funds in Price Hill, Union Savings, Guardian Bank, and the Hubert Family Foundation. Next slide, please. I'm kind of excited about this concept. So we're utilizing a new concept where we are actually self-subsidizing affordability without the reliance on grants. We are doing this lockstep with the Mount Auburn neighborhood, and our vision is to create mixed income development on Law Street, which is a street that runs parallel to Vine Street and which is just north of Over the Rhine. And we'll be utilizing property owned by the Land Bank. Our REACH program, which focuses on creating market rate for sale housing in disinvested neighborhoods, is bringing, as part of Phase 1A, 6 market rate townhomes to the street. The proceeds from these 6 townhomes will subsidize HERC to construct 2 affordable homes on the street, which will look similar to the new construction townhomes. As you know, costs can be a challenge, especially since higher construction costs mean less funding for the affordable project. But we're continuing to mitigate costs in order to make things work. We also will work with the city of Cincinnati, who also owns land on that street, to acquire property from them in order to continue this work. In all, we plan to have over 20 new construction homes built on the street. Phase 1A is underway. Everything's under roof. It should be coming to market soon. And the goal for the HERC to start pre-development is on its way to starting in early 2022, I'm sorry. Next slide. We could not do this work without partnerships. We work in several jurisdictions outside of the city of Cincinnati to include Lincoln Heights, Mount Healthy, Silverton, Woodlawn, and Springfield Township. We also have many community partners, including Habitat for Humanity, Seven Hills Neighborhood Houses, Avondale Development Corporation, and the College Hill Kirk. In addition to these partners, the Port or Land Bank partners with nonprofit developers, including Over the Rhine Community Housing, Price Hill Will, and Working in Neighborhoods. Next slide, please. Our typical starting point with these entities begins with acquisition of vacant, blighted, and abandoned properties and placing them in a holding agreement. Those decisions are often informed by what our partners are doing, and the Land Bank acquires these properties, and they are usually vacant and blighted and woefully tax delinquent. As part of the holding agreement, once we acquire the property, we stabilize them and maintain them and hold them until our partners are ready to acquire them at a nominal cost. We then transfer the property when the community partner is ready to take on its redevelopment. Ultimately, these efforts result in new rental and homeowner units, as well as some naturally occurring affordable housing, some of which is income qualified and subsidized by either federal, state, or local subsidies. Next slide, please. One partner that we have done a lot of work with is Habitat for Humanity. We've acquired 50 parcels on their behalf, demolished 8 structures, which were just too far gone to be rehabbed, and stabilized an additional 4. Of these 50 parcels, we've sold them 31 at a very low cost and are holding an additional 14 for future transfer. Next slide, please. We're doing the same thing for working in neighborhoods where we've acquired 33 properties, of which 8 were demolished due to them being severely blighted. We've sold them 17 parcels and are holding additional 14 parcels for future transfer. Part of this work is assisting working in neighborhoods in their creation of 50 affordable net zero homes in South Cumminsville. Next slide, please. Not only does the Port Land Bank and Land Bank work with the external partners with land acquisition, we also work with our internal nonprofit partner, which is the HERC, to acquire land and houses for redevelopment in focused neighborhoods. One of these neighborhoods is the village of Lincoln Heights, where HERC is currently building 4 new construction homes on Jackson that is financed in part with Hamilton County home funds. So these houses are 3 bedrooms, 2.5 bath, about 1,800 square feet, and they will be sold to buyers who are at or below the 80% AMI and will have a 15-year affordable housing restrictive covenant on them. Next slide, please. In addition to HERC, our internal CDC, we have partnered with Over the Rhine Community Housing, where the Land Bank acquired, stabilized, and maintained four formerly blighted vacant properties in Lower Price Hill. There was a news headline last year in October when a portion of the city funding was at risk for this $14 million project. A great example of our public-private partnership work, even though the Land Bank was never mentioned, was the fact that we were able to acquire, stabilize, and sell these properties to OTRCH at a discounted cost. Without this work, the project would not have penciled, and we were able to put about $300,000 in subsidy into the project, which will help them to be able to make the project work. The project will result in deeply affordable units at 30 to 60% AMI. Next slide, please. Another project, which is kind of outside of our normal realm with regards to affordable housing, but is still a great example of public-private partnerships, is recently in the news, the former Eckstein School in Glendale, which was a school for Black children from 1915 to 1958. So it's a segregated school. The school was owned by a private developer who planned to demolish part of the historic structure. The Cincinnati Preservation Association stepped in with the aid of the community of Glendale and other interested partners, and has purchased the property from the developer, and has now asked the Land Bank to hold it, to acquire it and hold it until they are ready to redevelop it into a cultural art center. This is only one way of us creating equitable development. Next slide, please. Another way is that we contract for the work that we do, is how we contract for the work that we do. The Port has lofty goals to ensure that minority women and small businesses have opportunity to work on our projects. We have goals of 25% minority, 7% women, and 30% inclusion, small business inclusion on our properties. And as you can see here, we are well on our way of meeting or exceeding our goals, especially in our minority business work that we're doing. Next slide. We've been working with Hunn's Construction since 2015. And during that time, Eric Hunn, pictured here, has been able to grow his business from 2 employees to over 18. And he's been able to be sustainable at that rate. He's been able to do this based on our goal of providing consistency in contracting with small businesses. We meet with them regularly and let them know our projections for each year. And this information is then shared with their subcontractors so that they know that this is not a one and done deal. That way they can project out their workload, knowing that work is coming down the line. And as you all know, contractors are very hard to find right now. So when you can have a really good, dedicated group of contractors that know your work and can be dedicated to the mission that you're doing, that's valuable. So not only has Eric Hun been able to grow his business, his subcontractors have been able to grow as well. Next slide. While this property is not in the city of Cincinnati, it is an example of affordable housing that we're building, that Hun's Construction is building for us in the village of Lincoln Heights. So I just thought I would share what the end product would look like once we're done with the Jackson Street houses. Next slide, please. We have another exciting opportunity with the city of Cincinnati utilizing ARPA funds to create affordable homeownership opportunities throughout the city in 2022. We've received $2.5 million to help cover the gap in construction costs. And our goal is to not only create homeownership, but also to retain residents within the city. We plan to do this by leveraging partnerships, which include external CDCs as well as the HERC. Next slide, I'm sorry. Our goal is to create 50 new affordable housing units in the city while at the same time growing minority business contractors and creating new and growing new minority real estate developers, creating equity and a holistic approach for all. Next slide, please. So this map kind of shows some of the areas where we will be building the new construction homes, but it's not all inclusive, as we will also, outside of the city of Cincinnati's funding, we hope to get funding from the county as well to do more houses in the county. Next slide. As with any opportunity, there are some challenges, some of which Brian and Joe have also talked about, and they include the site conditions, but also the increased costs due to various factors. One being financing demands in the debt of construction and funding. We also want to continue to help minority businesses grow. And then with the ARPA funding, we wanted to make sure that we stay in compliance with our ARPA rules and regulations. Next slide, please. Our next step in building these 50 homes will include working with city administration and getting a development agreement signed, construction of phase 1, which includes mitigating costs, working with some of our community partners to include Nest in Northside, MKirk in Madisonville, as well as the HERC to build new construction housing, and then partnering with qualified developers and then next, we'll be requesting future funds from the city in order to continue our work in 2023. So stay tuned. We look forward to continuing our work with more public-private partnerships to include the Port, Land Bank, HERC, and all of our external partners. Thank you.
Wow. So thank you so much for that. I want to thank all of our presenters for a wealth of information. And we do have some time, and we want to go over a few questions. I think our audience can see that there's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of benefits to public and private partnerships. And just these three organizations are leading and heading in the right direction on how to provide not only rental housing, but home ownership, but also, and I want to emphasize, and this has been our theme today, social equity and jobs and organizations and businesses, small businesses growing because of the work and the partnerships and how they're focusing on doing that particular work. So just wanted to start off with a few questions that I had for the panel. And we'll start with Brian. Brian, can you just talk about, you talked about a lot of different projects. You gave us a lot of different variety of different scale of projects that you've done throughout the country. What challenges have you come across with public-private partnerships, let's say over the last year?
Well, we've had a ton of them over the last year. The pandemic really challenged our organization in so many different ways because we're fully integrated. So we have an architectural shop, and it affected architecture differently than it affected our construction company, and different than it affected our development company or our property management operations. We also have some hotels in our portfolio, and they were really hit hard. I think it was just a domino effect, and there was a lot of fear in the system. I think there was a lot of recollection from the recession in 2009 and 2010. And so the initial reaction that I think our industries all had were, we don't know how bad this is going to get, and we don't know how disruptive the pandemic is going to be to our entire business. And then sort of within months, I think we saw sort of some level of surprise that the economic systems didn't collapse like they did in 2009 and 2010. However, what was deeply impacted was the employment base, especially at the entry levels. The lowest paid workers were losing their jobs. People of color were losing their jobs. Women were losing their jobs at a much, much faster rate than sort of more professional level positions and that sort of thing. So we had a whole segment, really the service sector of the economy that still to this day has not fully recovered from the pandemic. And a lot of people just dropped out of the workforce as well. So today, what we're dealing with is the after effects of all of that. And we're dealing with supply chain issues on the construction side. We're dealing with construction costs that are all over the map. We're having a very difficult time predicting what construction costs will be. Our subcontractors on lumber, for instance, which tripled in price at one point. Our subcontractors will only hold their bid for 3 to 5 days, and then it's no good anymore. So we're having to pre-purchase materials now because we can't get things like dishwashers and washers and dryers and appliances and things along those lines. So major supply chain disruptions that are still happening. Very much so right now. The labor force, I'm hearing that the entry level labor force can't find jobs, but I see for hiring for hire job signs all over the place. So there's a huge disconnect in terms of where the opportunities are, what people are paying, and what folks are looking for out there. And I don't know the solution to that, quite honestly. And then on top of all that, I think the other big factor is the eviction situation. The eviction moratorium has officially been lifted federally, at least. There are some states that have some eviction moratorium still in place, but they've been struck down by the courts all the way to the Supreme Court. And how do we now deal with folks that are 6, 8, 12 months behind on rent, sometimes even longer than that, and sort of managing our way through that so we don't end up doubling our homeless population and entering to mass evictions is sort of the next big problem that folks are going to have to tackle.
Great. Thank you so much for that. You bring up so many points, Brian, that are challenges. But I would also say that your organization and the other 3 organizations have come up with solutions as well. So I'll move to Joe. With that being said, Joe, you talked a lot about local, neighborhoods. Can you just talk a little bit about how do you get local neighborhoods and how do you go about getting that buy-in? Because we all know that affordable homeownership and affordable housing sometimes creates a lot of conversation.
Yeah, Mr. Johnson, great question. To be local, you have to really, first and foremost, be local, or if you're not, be partnering with good local organizations that have strong credibility that can help introduce groups to organizations and to local community associations. You have to spend time. These projects aren't done overnight. You have to spend time in the local communities and hold meetings and and get a chance to dialogue with the community that you're trying to do work in. You have to get a chance to take their input and see how that impacts your project and try to integrate what they're telling you, because candidly, the folks that live local and where you're trying to do your project, they know the community the best, and they basically know what is best for the projects. So you have to spend time listening to the local folks, whether it's a local neighborhood association or if it's holding a local resident event at a local community center. Get a chance to exchange dialogue, tell the folks what you're planning to do, and get a chance to digest their feedback and try to integrate it into your project the best that you can. The worst thing you can do is try to trailblaze into a community and just cram a project down someone's throat that certainly doesn't want it. That never works, because ultimately there are channels of approval that will say that the local groups are really the ones they have to be comfortable, or most likely your project's not going to work in some form or fashion. You get to some type of approval level and it will get postponed because of that lack of local support. And also, I think it's a great part of the programs that we do as far as putting investments back into local communities by, as Brian mentioned, a lot of the construction dollars that we're expending to make these projects work, to be able to employ local general contractors and subcontractors and vendors and suppliers that live right in that community. It's a great thing to know that the funds that are going into the community to build these great projects are also going into the local businesses' pockets, as Deborah mentioned, to grow and hopefully become something bigger than they were before. And it touches many different income levels. It touches many different demographics. So I think that's the greatest thing that we sometimes experience as affordable housing developers, is the impact that we can have on a local community, all the while putting a great local asset in place that's going to be there for hopefully a very extended period of time and provide the very basic necessity of life, which is a home, right? So you can't dialogue enough with the local community, and you have to take time and you have to cultivate those relationships to get those buy-ins, because they don't happen overnight. And again, partner with as many good local organizations that you can.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And Deborah, you talk so much about a lot of the topics and a lot of the issues that were raised in other panels this morning, and then the backdrop of what this whole conference is about. And that is building wealth, and that is homeownership. Can you just talk a little bit about what are some of the challenges you see with rehabbing and building affordable homeownership? And I'm going to say properties, but really just building that affordable homeownership with the low to moderate income families across, Hamilton County.
Thank you, Greg. That's a great question. One of our goals is to create a holistic approach. For instance, in the Evanston community, we were invited into that neighborhood from the community council back in 2014. They had developed a housing strategy, and they wanted to be able to create market rate housing in the neighborhood because they had not had any for sale market rate houses for quite some time. So it had been truly disinvested. So we came in with our REACH program, which stands for Rehab Across Cincinnati and Hamilton County, where we acquired houses in a specific geographic area around Walnut Hills High School in order to bring all of those blighted, vacant, and abandoned houses back into productive use. So we kind of had to step up the prices of the houses. And so the first house we rehabbed and sold, we put about $170,000 into the house, maybe 180, and sold it for $79,900. But we had to create the market, and also had a lot of subsidy. Our goal was to do 30 houses there, 30 market rate houses there, in order to jumpstart the market so that private developers would come in. We also, once the pricing of the houses started going up, we applied for grant funds through the city of Cincinnati to also bring affordable houses to the neighborhood as well, so that once we started selling houses for the higher 200s, we have houses that are more affordable for so that everyone is able to come into the neighborhood. So we applied for a grant and we're able to do 6 houses in that neighborhood, in order to create opportunities for everyone to live there. And I have really one cool story where one of the houses that we rehabbed had been belonged to a family for 40 plus years. The parents died, the kids moved away, nobody maintained the house. It fell into total disrepair and wound up on a forfeited land list. We acquired that house, the HERC did, or the land bank acquired it. The HERC acquired it from the land bank and rehabbed it in order for it to be sold to an affordable home buyer. And one of the original owners of the house, one of the family members of that house, actually was able to purchase now a new house from us that was worry-free, everything's totally new, and bring that house back into their family, creating wealth opportunities, which for that family, and really bringing it, back home for them. In other neighborhoods, we are invited in. And so they're not afraid of asking for affordable housing to come into their neighborhood. Lincoln Heights, we have a really good relationship with them to bring it's sort of market rate and affordable at the same time, but Habitat is also there. And so we're trying to create a holistic approach and have clusters where we're bringing right now affordable housing, but they also want more market rate, and we'll work with them on those as well. Mount Healthy has done the same thing, invited us in. So it's great when the neighborhood or community invites you in and you have less pushback from the residents.
Yeah, I can attest to that with running the housing authority. It's definitely a welcome feeling when that happens. You guys have been great. We only have a few more minutes left. Unfortunately, I had tons of questions that our audience are typing in and things like that. Just one question that was out there that I want to just answer. Someone wrote about with a $40,000 loss per home that you're doing at the port, what is the goal of the organization? And I think you just said it, and that's why this is resonating with me. It's to help jumpstart the growth in the neighborhood, and with the hopes that you bring in other organizations, other businesses, market rate homes to mix in with that stabilization of those neighborhoods and communities. So if I can just, I would just throw that in, as that is one of the reasons why the port would do that as well. We got 2 minutes left, 30 seconds for each of you. Just give me 2 benefits that you see from public-private partnerships. And I'll start with you, Joe.
Yeah, absolutely. Candidly, it's getting housing projects done that wouldn't be able to get done otherwise. That's a big deal. It's great to add housing units where they weren't before, where they're absolutely needed. So just being able to do projects that wouldn't be able to be executed otherwise.
Okay. Brian?
I would say, a holistic approach, because, if a for-profit developer, and a lot of them do this, and we do it sometimes, go forward, try and build housing on their own in a vacuum. If nonprofits try and work in a vacuum, and we've seen historically government trying to work in a vacuum, trying to solve the housing crisis in this country, the outcomes are not nearly as positive as when you combine those disciplines and those sectors working together, because it brings in different perspectives, and all those perspectives are important. And it just simply results in better outcomes, better projects, better results for the community, and better results for the residents ultimately. And that's the most important thing. So I think that broad perspective is really the most important element of a public-private partnership, for sure.
Okay. And Deborah?
And I echo both Joe and Brian, and the work that we do we help bring the private market there. So we're doing work that the private market cannot bear because they're not built to lose money on every house. And so we're doing it in order to help jumpstart the market for private developers to be able to come in.
Yeah. Well, there again, I want to thank all the panelists. If you're out there and you're listening and you're saying public-private partnerships, I think you can see 3 examples of how it's working really well in our community, outside of our community. We definitely need more dollars to help spur and strengthen this. But there's a few things that all of our panelists said today that I want to leave you with, and some of the things that they think about and they do as these partnerships get stronger and better. They sell land for less than market value. They reduce their development fee to make sure projects work. They try to look at ways to reduce the development costs. So those are 3 of the strengths, and all of these organizations mentioned in all of their development and partnerships throughout. So again, I want to thank you so much for participating, and I'll turn it over to, I believe, Liz.
Thanks, everybody. I just, particularly to Greg Johnson and that panel, the amount of expertise that we just heard from to produce affordable housing and market rate housing is pretty spectacular. I know one of the things that we've had a lot of conversation about in the chat is wanting to make sure that we're talking about solutions. And I think this region knows how to do these things. We just have to put the pieces together. I want to let everybody know we're going to break. We want you to come back at 2:00, which is about 8 minutes from now. So get some more coffee. Please know that what you're coming back to is another really outstanding panel on financing for Black homeownership and affordable housing. And then finally, we'll wrap it up with, we'll have Jim back, our keynote speaker, Commissioner Driehaus and Derek Dansby. So take 5 and be back at 2. And don't forget to go to the expo booths because they've got some really great information in them.